Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un at the Victory Day parade in China, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, and what it all means for order and U.S. alliances in Asia. Next on The Impossible State.
North Korea is the impossible state. It's a place that stumped leaders and policymakers for more than 3 decades. It has a complex history, and it has become one of the United States' top national security priorities. Each week on this show, we'll talk to the people who know the most about North Korea.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the CSIS Impossible State podcast. I'm your host, Victor Cha, President of Geopolitics and Foreign Policy at CSIS, Korea Chair, and also Professor at Georgetown. Today, we're going to be talking about a number of big diplomatic events, most of them centered around China over the last week, and what they mean for U.S. alliances in Asia, global order or disorder, as the case may be. And we've got 2 wonderful guests to have this conversation with. Today we're here with Dr. Ely Ratner and Scott Snyder, both good friends of CSIS, good friends of the program. Let me properly introduce them as we are trying to be very polite and orderly on the Impossible State. Ely Ratner is a principal at the Marathon Initiative, which is a think tank just down the street. You're like right across the street from us, right?
That's right.
But I think most of us know him from his time as Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific from 2021 to 2025 during the Biden administration at the Pentagon. He was also, prior to serving in the Biden administration, was in think tank world also as Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for a New American Security. And prior to that was Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden, if I remember correctly. He did his PhD in political science from UCal Berkeley. Where did you go undergrad? Did you go to Berkeley undergrad?
Princeton.
I went to Princeton undergrad. Oh, great. Scott Snyder, a good friend of the Korea Chair and CSIS, is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Prior to that, he was Senior Fellow for Korea Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is the author, right? There are only 2 books listed here, but you've written like 5 or 6 books, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
5 or 6? Do I have that right?
5 or 6.
5 or 6 books. Covering all sorts of topics related to Korea, South Korean foreign policy, if I remember, South Korea-China relations, North Korea negotiating behavior. You have a long list. And he is a graduate of Rice University, and he did his MA at Harvard. So thanks, guys, for joining us today on The Impossible State. So I want to start off by talking about the news that was pretty much like anybody covering foreign affairs over the last week. There's been all this talk about the SCO, and then in particular the Victory Day celebrations. We have this one picture we can pull up of the trio of Xi Jinping. There you see Xi Jinping in the center and Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. I think the hot mic caught them talking about living forever, or living 150 years or something like that. But I guess I want to start out and ask you both, we've had these 2 big meetings. They got a lot of press. The SCO and the Victory Day celebrations talk about like a new axis forming. Is this a change in the world order? And maybe just some perspective to start off from both of you on what sort of meaning you took away from these meetings. Was there anything that happened at these meetings that you thought was consequential? And then what this means for our alliances in Asia, what it means for, Trump's Indo-Pacific policy, things of that nature. So Ely, why don't we start out with you?
Yeah, happy to start. And Victor, wonderful to be here with you and Scott. I mean, maybe the first thing to say about this is I don't think this is particularly new. This is not a new phenomenon. And you mentioned my PhD at Berkeley. This was more than 20 years ago. I was helping to run a program while I was doing my PhD at Berkeley that we called The World Without the West. And it was looking at this exact phenomenon of deepening integration between China and the non-Western world that was happening at rates faster than globalization itself. So this has been ongoing for decades now, and I think it's been a central part of China's strategy to be at once hollowing out what we referred to as the Western-led order, while at the same time building alternative institutions, alternative norms, and an alternative order. So I think it has been going on now for decades as a feature of Chinese foreign policy. I think what's a little bit different here is just the openness of it. And if we think of, in many ways, Xi Jinping's first decade in power, we saw him really shed Deng Xiaoping's dictum of hide and bide, a much more willingness to express Chinese power in and of itself. I think what we're seeing here is in some ways maybe a second phase of that, which is a much more openness to express Chinese power on the world stage, which is something they have been a little bit reluctant to do heretofore. So in that sense, I think the phenomenon not new, the openness quite new. Another thing I would say about this is, from my perspective, particularly in the context of the United States having taken a more competitive turn toward China, that this is largely inevitable and in some ways is actually a product of the effectiveness of U.S. strategy, that China, for instance, cannot look to Japan or Korea or Australia or India or the EU for its security and for political alignment. So naturally, it's going to be looking toward Russia, DPRK, other like-minded countries. And I think, one of the implications of that is you hear U.S. policymakers or strategists or others talking about what is sometimes secondhand as a reverse Kissinger. Somehow can we pull these countries apart? I don't think that's going to be possible. I think we're likely to see gravity pulling these countries together. It's going to be something that the United States is going to have to manage, maybe throw sand in the gears on particular issues, but it's going to be about wrestling with the consequences of this rather than somehow disrupting it. And then I guess the final reaction that I had, you have this picture up of Xi Jinping flanked by Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. When he rose to power and envisioned a rejuvenation of China and China rising to be a great power, does this photo encapsulate the club of leaders that he hoped to have at his side when China rose to greatness? So in some ways, yes, it's worrisome, and there are important things to be discussed here, but I think it also shows actually the limits of China's ability to rally the world much more broadly than a relatively finite set of leaders.
And it's interesting. I was struck by one of the things you said was wrestling with the consequences rather than disrupting. So, what are the sort of consequences you think that the United States and our alliance system now face because of this more open effort by China to play this larger order-building role, if we can call it an order-building role? I tend to think of it as, to me, this was not a declaration of a new order, but it's a kind of a declaration of disorder. Like the system that the West built is falling apart, or it's showing cracks, and rather than like an actual alternative order, I don't see these three representing any sort of alternative order. But anyway, your thoughts?
No, I largely agree with that, and maybe another way to say that is I don't think this is a case where sort of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts,
right.
But it is a case where the sum of the parts is growing.
Yeah.
So that if you look inside these relationships, I think what we see are strengthening, in large part, bilateral relationships between, obviously, China and Russia in the context of Ukraine and the defense industrial base there, DPRK and Russia also in the context of Ukraine, but now some of that support moving in the opposite direction in terms of technology. So there are clear military implications, and I think there are going to be obviously issues for South Korea and how the region and the world will or will not move to manage the North Korea problem. But I think in general, It is going to create pressures, economic, political, technological, and military.
Yeah. I want to bookmark the DPRK Russia issue and talk about it later in the podcast, because we've done a lot of work on this, and I know that you guys have thought about it a lot. But if I could, again, go back to something Eli said and take it to you, Scott, this idea that the three of them are there. There's some strong bilateral ties that are growing here, particularly DPRK Russia or China Russia. Maybe you could say a little bit about this picture, and in particular the Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un part of it, because it seems to me like this is probably the only time I can remember where it was probably the Chinese that wanted the North Koreans up on that stage more than the North Koreans necessarily cared to be on that stage. But I'd love your thoughts on where you think DPRK China is right now, and this meeting in Beijing.
Yeah. Well, let me just step back and make a couple of other observations as
Please.
well. I agree. The multilateral trajectory has been, the emphasis on multilateralism from China has been there for a long time. But it hasn't necessarily, cohered into any kind of institutional depth. And I think that's really what Ely is talking about. Plus, I think it's absolutely right. Who's missing? The benchmark for me, as I think about Korea, was really 10 years ago, the 70th anniversary picture, which of course featured Park Geun-hye together with Xi and Putin. And of course, that was received very poorly here in Washington. Now, in a way, this picture, I think, kind of reverts to the expected order. But it's also the case that the picture, I think, projects a cohesion that is greater than the sum of its parts. And so if we look, first of all, no trilateral meeting between Xi, Putin, and Kim. 2 bilateral meetings for Kim with Putin and Xi, respectively. The meeting with Putin talked a lot more about tangible aspects of strategic cooperation related to the North Korea-Russia military supply relationship. And so that clearly is a significant development. The press takeaway from the first summit meeting between Kim Jong-un and Xi in 6 years was basically China downplaying denuclearization in their formal readout. We don't really know whether or not that was a shift yet, I would say, on the part of the Chinese government. It was notable, I think, that it was left out. And so, I mean, in a way, I think that what we have instead of trilateral cohesion that we see on the U.S., Japan, or OK side, what we see is really, in some ways, Kim Jong-un going back to the old strategy historically that Kim Il-sung had, which was playing these major powers off against each other in order to try to secure tactical advantage to the extent possible. And I think that's about as far as we can go at this point. So in many respects, I think what's really interesting is the psychological dimension of the respective bilaterals, because we know that these 3 authoritarian leaders cannot trust each other.
Yes. Great, great point. And it's a good reminder for those who don't follow this closely is that 10 years ago, right, we had a different Korea up on the stage. That was part of a different effort by both China and South Korea. I mean, for China to make leverage in the relationship with South Korea, and South Korea using it to try to gain China's advantage on North Korea, and both of them didn't work in the end, right?
Well, in that respect, it definitely reflects the setback of the current order in terms of geopolitical rivalry, kind of the return of a Cold War frame to peninsular issues.
Great, terrific. Eli, I want to go talk a little bit about the piece you wrote in Foreign Affairs for Pacific Defense Pact. It was a great piece. I think it's gotten a lot of attention. You're probably sick of talking about it by now. But in the context of what we've just discussed, you argue that it's time to sort of counter Chinese aggression with a formal alliance between sort of 4 maritime powers, right? The United States, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. So I guess a couple of questions. One is sort of what has been the reaction to the piece? And 2, do you think that what we've seen over the past week with the SCO and Victory Day is an argument for doing this sooner rather than later? So.
Well, thanks, Victor. I think the central argument of the piece was that what we are seeing is a continually growing PRC military challenge, and in order to maintain deterrence over time, we're going to have to strengthen and formalize the relationships between U.S. alliances, that this is an idea that's been floated for a long time, as you know, and the argument that I put forward is because of the nature of growing intra-Asia cooperation, growing capability amongst our partners, and the nature of the threat, that now is the time to consider this more seriously. In terms of the reaction that I've gotten, I think it has, as you said, generated a lot of debate, which was very much the point, and I'm encouraged by the discussion in capitals throughout the region about this. But I would just say I think there's 2 ways to look at this issue. And one is about politics and diplomacy, and what is the political viability in this moment of this kind of arrangement with the Trump administration at the helm, Trump administration's approach to alliances. I think there are legitimate questions there, but there is also a trend of deeper integration between Asian allies, and we, the United States, already have alliances with these countries. So the really most important part of a pact like that would be bringing the partners together, and that seems to me an important time to do that for deterrence. So there's a political, diplomatic question around viability at this point. But the other lens to look at this is through the military operational lens. And I think from that perspective, there is no question that we need to move towards something like this, because what we have now are a number of, as you know, historically bilateral relationships in the region. We did a lot during the Biden administration to try to build new constellations of economic, diplomatic, but also military cooperation. But those things are all very much informal and ad hoc, and they are not leading to the kind of true integration in the form of planning, command and control, other types of infrastructure that you need to actually conduct real military operations. So to me, it comes down to a question of, as we think about alliances, as we think about what some folks have called lattice work, bringing our allies together, are we doing that sort of as an expression of diplomatic and political unity, and we just want to do some exercises here and there? Or are we doing that because, no kidding, we actually want to be able to operate together in the event of crisis or contingency? And my view is we ought to be, and will need to be, doing the latter to have long-term deterrence in the region.
I mean, given the way you've described it, you would think that this is something that would resonate with at least some in the current administration that really want to, I don't know what the term of art is, recalibrate or reformulate our position in Asia, to really focus on, China, all right, whether it's Taiwan or anything in the first island chain. You would think this argument might resonate with them, provided it wasn't expending a lot of resources on the part of the United States. So any thoughts on that? I mean, has there been a response, or?
Well, I think that was part of the argument I was making, is that actually there is the element of countries in the region being more focused on China themselves, revising their national security strategies and defense strategies to be more focused on China. There's the trend of the greater intra-Asian cooperation, which is so important. But then there's this other piece, Victor, that you're talking about, which is this demand, and I think rightfully so in Washington, for greater reciprocity in our relationships, having our allies doing more in terms of these alliances themselves and stepping up to do more. And one of the important features of a Pacific Defense Pact is that it's not asking the United States to make new commitments or carry new burden. In fact, it's asking the allies and partners to play a more important role. And so I think in terms of the trend of domestic politics here in Washington, and I don't think that's just a Trump administration thing, I think that's going to cut across both parties, that we will be looking for allies and partners to carry more burden over time, and I think this is an important way to do it.
So since this is a podcast about Korea, so the country that was missing from the formulation was South Korea, and maybe you can give us your thoughts on that, and then I want to go to Scott. So.
Well, I'll start by saying one of the shortcomings in ideas or proposals in the past, or when people have thought about some kind of pan-regional security organization, it's a very diverse set of countries, a lot of diverse set of interests. To make something like this work, you need a real alignment of national security perspective. And I think between the Philippines, the United States, Australia, and Japan, you do have 4 countries there that all within the last 5 years or so have transformed or have started to transform their national defense strategies to be much more focused on China as their principal threat. So you have a high level of strategic alignment there, and you have a lot of cooperation already underway between those 4 countries. That isn't really true for Korea, and we haven't seen, as Korea, of course, is concerned about China as a national security issue, it still is, as you two know quite well, principally focused on North Korea, has not been, as much as we've tried to pull them into other type forms of cooperation, security cooperation throughout the region, has not been particularly involved in most of that cooperation. So my view on this was it ought to be an open architecture. Korea would be the most obvious next candidate as an incredibly capable military, close historical partner, but it would require them to have something of a transformative approach to how they think about the role of their military being more focused on China and more willing to operate off the peninsula.
Yeah.
But the door should absolutely remain open.
So the door is open. So Scott, we just had the South Korean president here last week, and the curtain raisers for that trip were that there was going to be a big discussion about China and strategic flexibility. What was your sense? Did Korea do anything on this trip that would signal they might want to walk through that door that Eli's talking about?
Well, I would say not enough for us to be really clear about where South Korea is going. I do think that the visit to Japan in advance of the visit to Washington by Lee Jae-myung was significant because that trilateral framework was enabled by the fact that those three countries, U.S., Japan, and South Korea, converged as related to their threat perceptions, and that includes both North Korea and China. And so what Lee Jae-myung had to say while he was in Washington was, we're not going back to a framework where we rely on China for economic opportunity and the U.S. for security. But I feel like he was not necessarily pressed to say what his forward-looking alternative strategy is. And I do think that Korea faces a bit of a dilemma as we focus on a Taiwan contingency as a pacing contingency and on China as a pacing threat. Because the Pacific Defense Pact, as configured in Eli's piece, it really does, I think, seem to focus on the idea that Taiwan is the focal point. And that presents a dilemma, I think, for South Korea, because in a Taiwan contingency, Korea ends up being a rear player, not a forward player. And yet with North Korea, it's always been a forward player. And I think that the question of where South Korea ends up going lies around the issue of whether or not you think that a Taiwan contingency in the end is containable to the cross straits, or whether it also, we're going to see horizontal proliferation to include North Korea. And I think that once one starts to think about that, it might lead to a different outcome in terms of the way that South Korea might think about how it relates to the other four countries that are in, Eli's proposal. But there are a lot of crosswinds and cross currents with regard to whether or not South Korea will get there.
Isn't Korea's role, isn't Korea's role in a Taiwan contingency, so there may, like, U.S. air assets may move off the peninsula and things like that, but isn't Korea's role in a Taiwan contingency to hold down the Korean peninsula? I mean, wouldn't that be their role? I mean, they might be a rear area support. They may do rear area support for Taiwan contingency, but if that's where the focus is, doesn't their role become to really ensure deterrence of North Korea from doing anything?
I think it depends on whether or not U.S. defense planners will give them credit for doing that, or whether they want more. And it's not yet fully clear to me exactly what the standard is that current defense planners are trying to set for allies like South Korea in that contingency.
Yeah. I mean, in fairness, to Eli, with regard to my question, I mean, if you put Korea in there, they probably would have hesitated, right? Because, like you said, they're trying to. Certainly they're facing threats from China. Certainly, all these countries have been targets of Chinese economic coercion and stuff they're doing in South China Sea and ADIZ and all this sort of stuff. But Korea's in a slightly different position. I thought what was interesting about President Lee's comments when he was here for the summit was I thought he was pretty clear that on economic security and military security issues, I thought his wording was like, we have no choice but to be with the United States, which was not language I expected to hear from him, certainly, and a different formulation than even what we heard from the government you worked with, the Yoon government, who was pretty forward-leaning for Koreans on Taiwan, right? But of course, the proof is in the pudding. We have to see. That's what he says when he's in Washington. We have to see what he says when he's meeting with Xi Jinping.
Yeah, and maybe just say one more thing about this, Victor, which is this was not a proposal to end all proposals.
Sure.
This is institution that would exist in the context of other, the way we thought about the multiplicity of institutions inside the Biden administration is that they were overlapping and complementary, and I think this would fit within that construct. So it
Right.
wouldn't
And you had
necessarily
Camp David, right? And you
Yeah,
had
it wouldn't
Camp
necessarily.
David,
I don't think this is certainly not at the expense of Japan, Korea, U.S. cooperation. I think the broader question, and it's not just a Taiwan question, is how do we feel about the fact that South Korea has not really been integrated into this much rapidly growing trend of inter-Asia security cooperation? I mean, obviously, arms sales, they do have security dialogues. We're seeing that growing with time. But in general, South Korea hasn't really been coming to the party, and I think that's not great for long-term regional security. And one of the things we tried to do during the last administration, it wasn't related to Taiwan, was to think about where are the opportunities where we can do things with South Korea off the peninsula, Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, and otherwise. And it was not easy.
No.
And it took years even to have baseline dialogues, to come up with activities. And I do think there is, if we want to talk about what is South Korea's role during a potential Taiwan contingency, and are they going to be mostly focused on holding down the peninsula? Maybe, but I don't think that absolves us from thinking creatively about how the U.S.-Korea alliance and how Korea with other Asian allies should be operating more together in regional security in other areas, whether it's the South China Sea, again, the Pacific Islands, or elsewhere.
No, I don't disagree with that at all. I remember there was a period of time during the Obama administration when you all were building all sorts of different sort of democracy-based groupings in the region. Even during Trump, some of this was taking place, and Korea was kind of on an island on itself. I mean, it had the trilateral with Japan, but like all these other things, Quad, whatever it was, they were not part of it. And,
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think this has always been their dilemma. They're happy to engage globally. They're happy to be part of the G7 plus, come to the NATO leaders meetings. But when it comes to the regional stuff, they have this China-North Korea problem that is perplexing. Let me move to the topic of DPRK Russia, and again going back to something Eli said in the beginning, wrestling with the consequences rather than disrupting. So I think on this program, we've talked a lot about DPRK Russia, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of what can we do about this? I mean, let me start with Scott. Like, what can we do about this relationship in which China seems to have, North Korea seems to have put itself in a position where it has leverage on both China and Russia right now, leverage on China derivative of Russia, and coming from a place where they were really in bad shape after the failure of the Hanoi summit. Then they go into a 3.5-year COVID lockdown. And then coming out of that, they managed to work themselves into a position now where they've got all this help from the Russians and they've got the Chinese like begging them to play ball again. Yeah. So how, like from a U.S. policy perspective and policy tools, what can we do to disrupt this?
Well, from the South Korean perspective, I would actually argue that the most important imperative for South Korea's policy toward North Korea and Russia should actually be to try to break that supply relationship.
Right.
And that means doing everything possible to also support an end to the conflict. But now I think that we're also at a point where even if you break the supply relationship, has enough momentum developed in the relationship that it will continue to persist in other forms. Because, the main thing that I think South Korea lost and that we've all lost strategically as a result of North Korea's connection with Russia is that North Korea used to be completely isolated. Mm-hmm. And that is simply not the case. And it bodes ill for our ability to both manage and contain North Korea and for our ability to potentially contain a conflict if it arises on the peninsula.
Yeah. Eli, what do you, to your credit, the Biden administration, and it helped us a great deal, you initially released imagery of one of the initial arms transfers with the Wagner Group. And then here at CSIS, we just took those date stamps and we started looking at all the imagery, and we saw all the activity that was taking place between the two sides. Just seems to have grown since then. Both when you were in the government and now that you're outside, like how do you think about how to disrupt this thing? So,
yeah, it's an incredibly hard problem. my point earlier was I don't think we're going to be able to pull these countries apart, particularly Russia and China, in any one way where we sort of flip them into an American friend contra the partner. But I think there are certainly some activities we can do to try to disrupt the movement of goods or whatnot. But I think, again, preparing for the consequences of, as Scott has said, one, a less isolated North Korea. What does that mean for prospects for regional or UN-based non-proliferation efforts? And then what does it mean for the capabilities that North Korea is essentially going to be able to acquire as a result of its relationship with Russia that will be moving at a faster pace than it would have indigenously. So that's something that has to be reckoned with from a planning perspective and a force posture perspective.
Right.
And then I think for Korea, thinking about obviously its alliance with the United States, but also its other partnerships in the region. The fact that the Korea-Japan relationship has endured through this period is, I think, no fluke. I think it has to do in part with some of these other, the broader regional security environment. And then, of course, South Korea having to reckon with its own capabilities and its own force modernization, particularly in the context of uncertainties about the future of the alliance with the United States. So I think all of these things are in play, but it seems like definitely a more harrowing position for South Korea to be in, but one where it's going to have to strengthen its relationships and strengthen itself.
Yeah. I mean, you can tell me what you think about, both of you think about this, but I don't really see a policy tool that the United States has that can disrupt DPRK Russia. About the only thing that we could hope for is that they become too close and Russia starts to take the North Koreans for granted and the North Koreans start feeling paranoid about getting too close to Russia, just like they have historically with regard to China. Putin feeling like he can call on North Korean troops to go anywhere he wants, like send them to the Baltics, right? Send them to, the border here, send them to the border there. But that only happens if they become even closer. I mean, I can't really think of anything else that we can do. I mean, we can try to incentivize either party, but that doesn't lead in a good direction either, so.
And then, of course, I think there's the broader question. I'd be very interested, actually, in Scott and Victor, your answer to this is how does North Korean behavior shift as it feels less isolated, as it feels more connected economically, a little more secure from a military perspective? What does that mean for its behavior on the peninsula and regionally? And I don't think it's just a straight line trajectory to more instability. I think it's more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the time that we have left, Scott, I want to ask you what everybody has. One of the things for North Korea watchers that people have talked about with regard to the Victory Day celebrations has been that Kim Jong-un didn't come alone. Like he brought his 12, 13-year-old daughter with him, and there's all this question about whether there is a succession we are watching a succession process or a grooming process being undertaken or being executed with events like this. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, we all have to think about it. It's not a question that I'm very enthusiastic about, though, because so far I don't feel we certainly see the framing of the issue and the implied outcome, but I don't think that we've yet seen anything definitive. From my perspective, there are two dimensions that are really significant right at this moment. One, the fact that Kim Jong-un had such a short runway in his own experience of succession. And so I think that probably has driven him to try to at least create the timeline and optics signaling a stability in succession at a relatively early stage. The second dimension that is really interesting related to the China visit is that historically the North Koreans have sought to get the Chinese stamp of approval for succession. I mean, there's even reports about Kim Il-sung bringing Kim Jong-il at an early stage in the 1970s to Beijing for kind of stamp of approval, and the Chinese essentially resisting that. And then I think around 2009, 2010, after Kim Jong-un was named, we did see actually the Chinese embassy paying a lot of attention to Kim Jong-un. And so it stands to reason that that I think that the images of her in Beijing are important, but at the same time, she really wasn't center stage. She was really off stage for most of the visit, and so it does make one wonder what was going on backstage.
Right. Great. Well, that, I think, is about all the time we have for this episode. So both Eli and Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Again, if you haven't read it, it's a terrific piece, Ely Ratner's piece in Foreign Affairs on the case for a Pacific Defense Pact. And so thank you both for being on the show. Thank you to our listeners and viewers for another episode of The Impossible State. We'll see you in 2 weeks.